Today, we're going to talk about the Jurassic fossils on Skye and Eigg and the Inner Hebrides. So you're pretty lucky because you've got 4 speakers for the price of 1. There's myself to begin with. My name's Elsa Panciroli. I'm a researcher at Oxford University and at the National Museum of Scotland. But you also have in the house Dr. Susannah Maidment, who's a researcher from the Natural History Museum in London. So she's going to tell us more about dinosaurs in the Jurassic. We have Dr. Gregory Funston, who's a researcher at the University of Edinburgh, and he specialises in histology, so that's the microstructure of bones. So he's going to tell us what that tells us about extinct life. And then we have Paige dePolo, who is a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and she'll tell us more about the footprints that she studies on Skye. So after our talk, we would love to have any questions, discussion that you have either about this talk or generally about dinosaurs or Scotland's fossils, whatever it is that you're interested in. So let's get started. Well, I'm sure everybody here knows the geography of Scotland, but just in case, this is, of course, Scotland, and along the west coast are the Western Isles. Now, on the very outer part of those isles, that's obviously the Outer Hebrides, but sandwiched between them and the mainland of Scotland are the Inner Hebrides. And the islands we're going to talk about today are the Isle of Skye and Eigg. And Skye is the largest of the Inner Hebrides. Eigg, you can see, is just nestled below it, quite small, not as big as its sort of larger, more rugged neighbour, the Isle of Rum. And they sit in the Minch. And they are, of course, famed for being beautiful places to visit as well, as I'm sure a lot of you will know. Now, you might have recently seen that there was quite a kerfuffle in the news about the dinosaur bone that was just found on the Isle of Eigg. So the reason that you have the lineup that you have is because Susie, Greg, Paige and myself were all among the many co-authors who were on the paper that described that bone. So I found that bone during fieldwork in Eigg in 2017. And I'd like to come back to that a little bit later on, but first talk a little bit more about the discoveries that have been made in general. So this is actually the latest in a very long line of discoveries from the Inner Hebrides. Invertebrate fossils have been known from the Hebrides for a couple of hundred years at least. But since the 1970s on the Isle of Skye in particular, we've had a real sort of plethora of fossils being found. Many of them found by Dougal Ross, who you'll see there in the top left corner of the screen. And these discoveries include dinosaurs, marine reptiles, crocodiles, early mammals, turtles, dinosaur footprints, loads and loads of different things, all found over the last 40 years. A lot of them actually haven't reached the newspapers, but here's a few that have, with some dubious headlines. So all of these fossils are Jurassic in age, and they all come, really almost all of them, from the Isle of Skye. So this has led people to dub Skye Scotland's Dinosaur Isle. I personally, I'm not so fond of that title because I think really the dinosaurs might be one of the least interesting groups that you can find on Skye, but I would say that because I'm biased. I work on mammals. So yeah, people do love dinosaurs. So work is continuing on Skye, and there's actually a lot of people involved in what's going on up there. We've got researchers from the National Museum of Scotland, but also the universities of Edinburgh, Oxford, Birmingham and Glasgow. And there's undoubtedly, not only is there a lot more to be discovered, but I know that in the next couple of years, you're going to see some really exciting new papers coming out and some new discoveries being published. Now, before we go on, I want to make a plug for this book. Some of you may have already seen it. This is a fantastic sort of collection of information about the Jurassic fossils of Skye, written by Dougal Ross and Sarah White. Now they're pictured here on the screen together with the book at one of the launches. Unfortunately, the launch date for their book was the end of March. And some other things happened at the end of March, which means that basically you might not have heard about this book. But it is absolutely excellent. It's really, really well written, accessible for the public, but packed full of scientific information about the geology and the fossils. All the proceeds for this for the sale of the book go to keeping Staff and Dinosaur Museum running. Now that's Dougal Ross actually built and runs this museum on the Isle of Skye. So I highly recommend you give it a Google and perhaps buy it. Christmas is not far away. It'd be a good gift. So why is Skye such a Jurassic fossil hotspot? I think to understand that we kind of have to go back in time to begin with and take a look at the world in the Middle Jurassic. and the geology of the Inner Hebrides. So this is more or less what you'd see if you were floating above the globe 166 million years ago. And it's somewhat familiar, but a little bit odd, isn't it? And in the middle there, you can see a cluster of islands. I wonder if you can actually see my mouse there. A cluster of islands in the center of the large continents. Now, the UK, or Great Britain, the British Isles, should I say, and parts of Europe would have been sandwiched in there. And Scotland was positioned in this seaway between the cold boreal ocean to the north and the warm Tethyan Ocean to the southeast. And we know from observing the oceans today that where warm and cold waters meet like this, there's often really rich marine ecosystems fed by upwellings of nutrients and blooms of plankton. And the fossil evidence suggests that the seas around the UK at that time were exactly like that. So Scotland was about 20 degrees further south, a similar position to the Mediterranean today, and it was warmer and it was more humid, although I'm not really sure how it could possibly be more humid if anybody's done any field work in Scotland. And we know that there was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere because there's increased carbonate deposition at that time in the rock record. We can see that most of England was submerged, but most of Scotland was actually emergent at this time. And just like today, the Inner Hebrides are in that gap between the Outer Hebrides and mainland Scotland. Now this map shows something slightly different. Here we're actually seeing the deposits of Middle Jurassic rocks, or sorry, just Jurassic rocks in the British Isles, all marked in blue. And as you can see, the Hebrides Basin up at the top there is one of the only deposits where there are onshore outcrops in Scotland. There's a little bit along the rim of the Moray Firth coast, but we don't have very, very much. So this is why a lot of the discoveries happen in the Hebrides and not elsewhere. Now, further south, there are much more extensive outcrops of Jurassic material in England, and these have yielded many of the first dinosaurs and the marine reptiles and pterosaurs found in the 1700s and 1800s. And they do continue to yield really significant fossils today. In fact, I'm sure you know the English Jurassic coast is one of the best places to hunt for fossils for professionals and the public. So what is the stratigraphy? What are we looking at on Skye? Well, the Jurassic layers that yield all the fossils are part of the Great Estuarine group. You can see marked there, sort of shaded in blue. And these rocks have received a lot of attention from geologists as well as paleontologists because they capture this really interesting alternation from a lagoonal environment to a shallow marine environment. And this is because the land was actually rising and falling. So rather than it being eustatic sea level changing, it's actually a sort of doming and falling of the land. And if you look alongside the Great Estuarine group here, you can see that the sea levels were generally quite low. So that means a lot more terrestrial input. So terrestrial fossils are just basically a lot more common. So it's quite a good time period to look at if you're a paleontologist. So let's start with Skye. You may recognise this from the Scottish Geology Trust website, and it is, I believe, the Trotternish Peninsula on Skye, although I guess I should have probably checked that. I just assumed looking at it that it must be. It's, of course, this dramatic landscape. And when we take a look at a really simplified geological map of Skye, you can see what creates this drama. Everything that is coloured here in green, red and fuchsia are basically volcanic rocks. And these were extruded around about 55 million years ago, not long after the extinction that wiped out the non-bird dinosaurs and lots of other major reptile groups. So these floods of lava coat the whole island like a blanket, and this is not good news if you want to find fossils. But we're lucky because around the edges of this blanket, especially in the very north in the Trotternish Peninsula, but also in the south in the Strathearn Peninsula, there are Jurassic rocks lying underneath them that poke out. And these have been exposed due to erosion from the sea and of course from ice during the Ice Age. And it's in those rocks that we find the fossils that make Skye so famous. Those are coloured yellow here in this diagram. So there's two main localities on Skye where you find fossils. In the north, as we talked about, the Trotternish Peninsula. Now this is where all the dinosaur footprints are located, but also body fossils of things like crocs and marine and flying reptiles have been found there. Now, the south of the island is actually where I do most of my work, and that's where we have actually the richest vertebrate fauna, so the most diversity, and this is part of the Kilmalooeg Formation. And the fossils from this area include mammals, lots of different types of small reptiles, salamanders, turtles, crocodiles, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, fish. It's a real plethora of creatures that we get from this part of the island. And there's an example of one of the little jaws that we found down in that part of the island. A lot of them are very small. So of course, perhaps because of that, don't demand quite so much attention from the general public and from the media in particular. But the reason we find such a unique fauna in the south is that it represents a much more freshwater lagoon environment. Now, Paige is going to tell you in just a moment about the more brackish to marine rocks that dominate the rest of Skye. But in the south, the layers are dominated by this argillaceous limestones and mudstones, and they are absolutely packed with ostracods, concostricans, and gastropods, and they're all freshwater. So this tells us so much about the ecosystem here, that it was really unusual among the Great Estuarine Group for being such a freshwater environment. So finding our fossils is, as you can see, extremely glamorous work. People have been looking for them in this part of the island for, well, we've been working there for a decade, but people actually started looking in this particular part in the 1970s. And to find fossils there, you crawl along the ground, as Roger is demonstrating in this photograph, with your hand lens, because all of the stuff that we're really interested in, the really significant stuff, is very, very small. The Kilmalloog Formation yielded the first Mesozoic aged mammals from Scotland in 1972, and more recently we even had our own special Scottish Jurassic turtle called Elankelis, so the island turtle. But there are lots of other fossils to be found here, and they really give us this rich picture of the diversity of the ecosystem in this part of Skye in the Middle Jurassic. And recently I published a review with my colleagues where we showed that the Kilmalloog Formation in Scotland, the unique preservation that we find there, where fossils are not only much more complete than in places, the localities we talked about, for example, in England, but they're also preserved in 3 dimensions rather than being squashed or crushed like they are, for example, in China, which is a lot more famous for its Jurassic fossils. These facts make it actually a globally significant site for understanding the Middle Jurassic ecosystem. An ecosystem that perhaps would have looked somewhat like this: very rich, very lush, freshwater environment, and incredible diversity of creatures. But this is just one moment, of course, in the island's history. So to look at another side of the Middle Jurassic of Skye, I would like to hand over to Paige, who's going to tell you more about her work on dinosaur footprints. Hopefully.
Thanks, Elsa. Yeah, thanks, Elsa. And hi, everyone. I'm going to keep my my video off because my computer is 12 years old and struggles with doing more than one thing at a time. So today, Elsa, can you advance the slide? Thank you. I'll be chatting very briefly about Skye's dinosaur footprints and the rocks in which they're found. So dinosaur footprints are some of the most common vertebrate fossils on the island and are found in many members of the Great Estuarine Group. Interestingly, in addition to being found in the freshwater environments of the Kilmalloog that Elsa just spoke about, dinosaur footprints are also found in the deltaic sandstones of the Valtos Formation and in brackish lagoons of the Nontalum Formation. So the locations of these footprints indicate that dinosaurs spent time walking right along the edge of Scotland's Jurassic coast. Next slide, please. Thank you. Scotland's first dinosaur footprint was found in the early 1980s and can be seen in the upper left-hand corner of your screen. It was tridactyl, which means it had 3 toes, and it most likely belonged to an ornithopod. So you can imagine an early relative of the charismatic dinosaurs that we think about, like Iguanodon and Hadrosaurus. And additional investigation of Skye's footprints, mainly spearheaded by Neil Clark and Doogie Ross in the late 1990s and early 2000s, resulted in a wide variety of tridactyl 3-toed morphologies being recognized on the island. And some of that variety can be seen on our screen here. So these studies showed that in addition to the ornithopods on the island, there were also bipedal meat-eating theropod dinosaurs that lived in Jurassic Scotland. Next slide, please. In the mid-2010s, a completely new shape of dinosaur footprint was found on Skye, and this is really interesting, completely different than what's seen before. So these new tracks were subcircular to suboval, approximately the size of bin lids and had forward-facing toes. And this is something that our Scottish geology aficionados are probably quite familiar with because there have been some tours up to the sites, and they're pretty impressive, span a lot of the platforms, and were probably made by long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. Next slide, please. And finally, earlier this year, so the Edinburgh crew described another new type of dinosaur track from Scotland. So these are much smaller than the sauropod tracks and are quadrupedal, like the sauropod tracks, but have a different shape for the hand and footprints. So the hands are semicircular and the footprints are subtriangular. They belong to the ichnotaxon Deltapodus and were most likely made by a stegosaurian track maker. And stay tuned, because this is important later. Foreshadowing. Next slide, please. So when we consider all of Skye's dinosaur footprint diversity together, there's a really astonishing diversity of dinosaurs seen on the Trotternish Peninsula, living in this Middle Jurassic ecosystem. And these two paintings are from Scottish-based paleontologist John Hode, and they illustrate the scene well, with huge sauropods wandering in coastal lagoons, flanked by smaller ornithopods, stegosaurs, and theropods. They're a little bit closer to shore on subaerial mudflats. Skye's trace fossils tell us a lot about the animals that lived here about 170 million years ago. But this isn't the only island that's helping us understand this story. And I'm going to pass the presentation back to Elsa now, so she can talk about the most recent piece of the Scottish dinosaur puzzle.
Can everyone hear me? Nods? Good. Thanks, Paige. That was awesome. I love those footprints so much. So let's move a little bit south now, from Skye down to Eigg. Now, this is a very simplified map of the geology of Eigg. I was trying to find a simple map and I couldn't find one, so I doodled one. But it gives you the basic idea. So Eigg is, of course, an amazing place to visit. I'm sure a lot of you have been there and have certainly heard of it. It's owned by the islanders, making it quite unique. And it's famous geologically for the Skur of Eigg, which is, it dominates really the southern half of the island. And I know Angus has done a lot of talks about the geology of the Skur and has also taken many groups there. So I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm sure you guys probably all know a lot more about that than me. As well as the stunning volcanics, there is also this thin rim of sedimentary Jurassic rock that peaks out around the northern part of the island along the shore. And it's the same pattern really as we see on the Isle of Skye. And historically, that part of the island has yielded lots of marine reptiles and fish fossils, and very famously those discovered by the Highland geologist and writer and stonemason, Hugh Miller, in the early 1800s. Now, they're part of the same sequence of rocks as on the Isle of Skye, the Great Estuarine Group, and these are also the rocks where we made this recent discovery of a bone, the first dinosaur fossil found outside of the Isle of Skye. I feel like I've told this story a million times in the last couple of weeks, but basically to give you the lowdown of what happened. So there was a small crew of us from the University of Edinburgh and National Museum of Scotland on the island doing field work sponsored by National Geographic. And we really expected to find more of these marine reptiles that had been found previously, and also fish and things like that I've mentioned. So at the end of one of the days of us searching, I was running back along the shore, hopping from boulder to boulder, and I suddenly realised that the boulder I just stood on had something in it. And when I turned and walked back, this was what I saw. And I realised that it had, well, I was pretty sure it had to be the bone of a dinosaur, but I wasn't 100% sure. So I went and got the rest of the crew, and yeah, we all unanimously agreed that that's really the only thing it could be. So that's how it was discovered. And a few weeks later, a small team returned to Eigg. This is Dougal Ross, who came back basically to cut it out of the shoreline with rock saws. And they took the specimen back to the mainland, and it was sent to Nigel Larkin at the Cambridge Museum of Zoology, who prepared it from the rock so that we could study it. And we knew it had to be a dinosaur, we thought, although could it be a marine reptile? We weren't too sure. So to figure this out, we had to bring together a team with expertise in lots of different dinosaur groups and lots of different areas. And one of those experts and the leader in her field is Susannah Maidment, who is now going to take over and tell you a bit more.
Right, I think I'm unmuted now. Good, hopefully. Hello everybody. Thank you, Elsa. Right, so yeah, I was asked to come on board with this exciting discovery when this bone was found and after it had been prepared by Nigel. And it was very clear to the team straight away that, you know, as you can see, this bone is rather fragmentary. And there weren't any features on it which immediately allowed them to tie it to a particular group of dinosaurs. Could I have the next slide, please, Elsa? So what I've just stolen Elsa's beautiful reconstruction of the environment in Skye here, but what we wanted to do was, we knew we weren't going to definitively be able to tie this bone down to a particular dinosaur group. So what we thought was, well, let's have a look at all of the other animals that are around at the time that we know about. And try and narrow it down and just kind of compare the general shape and size and proportions of the bone and see if we can figure out what this bone might have been from. So here are some of the animals that I've highlighted that we considered. Elsa already said marine reptiles because as you know, there's many marine reptiles from this part of Eigg. And so we had a look at the marine reptiles, which I've circled a croc there. And then there's the long neck, long tailed dinosaurs, which you've heard a little bit about their footprints from Paige as well. And then the meat eating dinosaurs, and of course the armored dinosaurs, including the stegosaurs. Now there are in this beautiful picture some smaller dinosaurs too, but we knew that the bone wasn't from one of those because it was too big. It was just a little bit too big. So we all went away and had a bit of a think and compared this bone to pretty much every bone that we could possibly come up with in the skeleton of all of these different dinosaurs. And the one that it really looked most like in terms of its shape, its size and proportions was one from a stegosaur. Could I have the next slide, please, Elsa? So this is Stegosaurus, and the bone that we felt it was most similar to was the lower leg bone called the fibula. Now this is the Stegosaurus on display at the Natural History Museum. It's one of the world's most complete. As you can see, our bone from Eigg is a tiny bit less complete than that, but we are at this point fairly confident that it is a stegosaur. Could you click the button, please, Elsa, and I'll do the comparison. So here is the lower limb of this beautiful Stegosaurus that we have, so it's called Sophie. And you can see this kind of thin, skinny bone down one side. There's two bones stuck together there because the lower limb is made up of two bones, the tibia and the fibula. So it's the one, the kind of skinny bone to the left of your screen. And then could you click the button again, please, Elsa? So there's the egg bone. And I think you can probably see that in terms of size, proportions, general sort of sturdiness, this bone, the two bones are quite similar. And that was the best sort of comparison that we could come up with. So we felt kind of confident that this probably belonged to an armored dinosaur and probably to a stegosaur. And that wasn't a huge surprise because, as Paige has said, we actually had stegosaur footprints from Skye, from similar aged rocks. And also there had been a fragmentary bone described as an armored dinosaur from Skye in the past. So it wasn't total surprise to us that this might be a stegosaur. We did do an extra analysis, which Greg is going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a minute. So I'll leave that to him. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about the implications of this find for our understanding of dinosaurs. Could I have the next slide, please, Elsa? So as Elsa has already described, during the Middle Jurassic, much of the UK and also of North America was covered in shallow marine conditions. And dinosaurs don't live in the sea, so we don't find very many dinosaur fossils at that time and in those places. And that's unfortunate because people have been looking for dinosaur fossils in Europe and North America for 150 years. And in the rest of the world, there are rocks that are of this sort of age, so Middle Jurassic in age, that were deposited on land, but they simply haven't been explored as much for dinosaur fossils. Now, we know we have a really good understanding of ecosystems like the one I've got in the picture here from the Cretaceous period, but there's a big question about how these Cretaceous ecosystems actually developed from the early Jurassic and even late Triassic when the dinosaurs first evolved. And the Middle Jurassic is really, really a key time for us to help us understand that question. Can I have the next slide? And this is particularly important for this group of dinosaurs called the bird-hipped dinosaurs, to which stegosaurs are a part. Now, the bird-hipped dinosaurs is a major group of dinosaurs. It includes pretty much all the herbivores that you can think about, except the long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs. So I've got a few examples here. We've got the ceratopsians, which are the horned and frilled dinosaurs. We've got the armored dinosaurs. I'm showing Ankylosaurus down here instead of Stegosaurus, just for a bit of variety. But that's also an armored dinosaur. And we've also got the hadrosaurs, which are the duck-billed dinosaurs. Now, these groups of dinosaurs, they radiated hugely during the late Jurassic and the Cretaceous to dominate the herbivorous ecological niche in at least the Northern Hemisphere, if not worldwide. Now, if we roll the geological record back to the early Jurassic, the bird-hipped dinosaurs, when they first evolve, are things like this little animal on the left of the screen here, which is a dinosaur called Lesothosaurus. It's from Southern Africa, and it's pretty small. Yeah, my pictures are not to scale here, I should say that, but Lesothosaurus is probably the size of a Labrador. You can see it's a two-legged dinosaur, and it looks rather different from these much later four-legged dinosaurs with these incredible sort of display structures. So there's a big question: how do we get from these two-legged dinosaurs to this incredible diversity of these Jurassic and Cretaceous forms that we know so well? And the key to answering that question is the Middle Jurassic, of which the rocks in Eigg and Skye are a part. And as I said, because all of North America and Europe was essentially shallow marine conditions in this Middle Jurassic time slice, it means we just don't have a good fossil record at all of the dinosaurs that lived there. And this is really problematic, because it really means that this early evolution of this group of dinosaurs is completely shrouded in mystery. In fact, I think there's only 5 dinosaurs that have been named from the Middle Jurassic, so it's really, really, really poorly known. Now, the bone from Eigg is fragmentary, but it's received a lot of attention. And with the ongoing research that the teams from the National Museums of Scotland, Edinburgh, Oxford and Birmingham have been doing, there's a huge potential that we might find some Middle Jurassic dinosaurs from Scotland that could really help us fill in this gap and really kind of expand our knowledge of the early evolution of these major group of Mesozoic terrestrial vertebrates. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Greg now, who's going to tell you a little bit more about how we really confirmed that the discovery was pretty much definitely a stegosaur.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. So I'm Canadian. I'm a bit of a latecomer to this project, actually, because I'd only arrived in Scotland in January. But my project coming here was to set up a histology lab, and I'll explain a little bit about what that means in a bit. But essentially, it means looking at the microstructure of bones to understand how they grew. Elsa, if you could go to the next slide, please. So much the way that tree rings essentially record a record of growth of a tree, dinosaur bones and bones of other kinds of vertebrates, including us, also lay down different types of bone growth marks. So if you look at this bone on the right here, this is a meat-eating dinosaur from Canada, and the kind that's on my shirt here, actually. And if you look just towards the top half of the bone, you can see these concentric rings in the bone, and those are actually annual layers that are deposited. Now, this is because, like a tree, most bones in dinosaurs and other vertebrates will grow by adding extra material to the outside of the bone. And so these rings essentially track the outside surface of the bone through the animal's lifetime. And if we look at the different spacing of those rings, we can kind of get a sense of the way that an animal has grown throughout its lifetime. If you could go to the next slide, Elsa. So my job was, the first thin section that I made in my lab here was to create a thin section of this bone from Eigg to see if we get any insights on the style of growth that this animal had throughout its lifetime. And right off the bat, as soon as we made the thin section, we got quite a bit of data on the kinds of animal that this could or could not be. And this is because animals grow in different kinds of ways. And we can see that even today. If you look at the styles of growth in a mouse versus an elephant, I mean, they grow in quite different ways, and you can actually see that in their bones. So when we look at this bone, we can tell that it has a spongy interior and a kind of more dense, filled in cortex is what we would call it, the outside part of the bone towards the top left of your screen. Now this immediately ruled out any kind of marine reptile, because marine reptiles living in water, they use their bones as ballast. And so they quite often will have very porous bones, or conversely, they'll have very, very dense bones. And so the fact that this bone has both combined in one single element really kind of rules out any kind of marine reptile. And so that was great because, of course, with all of the marine reptiles from Egg, that was the first thing that really had to be eliminated. Now, if we look a little bit closer at the bone, and Elsa, if you click, yeah, if we look at this region here of the cortex, that preserves a lot of the growth record. And if we zoom in on that, if you could click, we can actually see that a lot of the original bone texture is preserved. So as I was saying, down in the bottom of the slide, there's a lot of the spongy bone, and we can see that it becomes more dense towards the outside. But we can also see these kinds of open spaces or black marks in the denser part. And those are actually the spaces that would have been filled in life by blood vessels. And this is because bone is a living tissue. You don't often think so, because when we see bones, usually it's without the meat attached. And so they kind of seem like this inert object. But as bones grow, they're actually they're a living tissue, and that's why they're able to heal and remodel themselves and grow throughout your lifetime. So they need a supply of blood for nutrition. They need minerals to be able to fill in. And as you grow up, even in humans, you'll find that the texture and the shapes of the bones change considerably over an animal's lifetime. And so that means that there's lots of remodeling that has to be done. Now, if you click on the next slide, Elsa, we're going to zoom in again. And if you click one more time, we can actually see there's a really good growth record preserved here. So each of those little black spaces is for a blood vessel. And you can see, although they are fairly dense, they're not super dense. So compared to some other dinosaurs that we have, this is relatively low vascularity bone. And that essentially means that the supply of blood that was coming to this bone is fairly low, and so we can infer that it wasn't growing very quickly. Now, if you're able to click again, Elsa, each of these tiny little donut-shaped things that you can see towards the bottom of the screen and towards the middle of the screen, each of those is what's called a secondary osteon. And those are very special structures because essentially they're the way that a bone repairs itself. So when you do any kind of strenuous activity, or I mean, especially if you break a bone or something like that, you'll get tiny cracks throughout your bone, what are called microfractures. And essentially the bone repairs these by excavating it and then filling it in with new material. And in doing so, it creates these tiny little donut-shaped structures around the blood vessels that excavate, and they cross-cut the bone. And so this is a way to tell how much of a bone has been remodeled and repaired. And this is useful because different animals have different rates of remodeling depending on their body mass, the rate at which they're growing, how strenuous their activity is. And you can even see these between different bones. So for example, if you were to make a thin section of human bones, our legs would have much more secondary remodeling than, say, our arms, because we tend to use our legs for weight bearing. And so there's more biomechanical stress on those. We also had one other little bit of information to come from this, although it wasn't hugely useful. There's one, you might be able to see it just above the back end of the arrow there. It's pretty imperceptible at the scale on my screen, but it's what's called a line of arrested growth. And that's those tree ring lines that I was telling you about in the very first slide that I spoke on. And so that essentially tells us that this dinosaur was at least 1 year old. Considering its size, it was probably substantially larger or substantially older. But at least this gives us kind of an indication that we're looking at an animal that is not a complete juvenile. This thing is at least 1 year old. And so that makes a lot of sense with the size that it's at. But interestingly, we could also tell that it's not really a full-grown adult yet. And that's also part of a key into its identity. And we can tell that because it doesn't have a bunch of growth lines towards the outside of the bone. So for example, if you think about a human again growing, most of us will grow until we're maybe 16, 17, 18 in height, and then we grow in weight after that, especially myself. But this animal doesn't have that. And so essentially what you would see if you were to thin section one of my bones is that all of my growth marks from 18 onwards would be very closely packed right at the edge of my bone. And all of the growth from beforehand would be spaced out. So I'd be growing more in each of those years. And in this animal, we can tell that there's one growth mark kind of towards the middle of the bone, but there aren't any towards the outside of the bone, which is the top of your screen. And that essentially means that this animal was putting on a lot of weight and size in its last year of its life before it tragically died. Elsa, could you advance? Perfect. So the other thing that we wanted to do is that because we knew that there were some other candidate dinosaurs that this thing could have been, specifically the sauropods, which are the long-necked, long-tailed herbivores, and theropods, which are the meat-eating dinosaurs. Both of those have been found in the Great Estuarine Group on Skye. And so we wanted to be sure that we could actually eliminate those as possibilities. And this was a best case scenario because usually the type of work that I do on microstructure doesn't give you much of a sense on the relationships of an animal or even its identity. It tells you a lot about the way that it grew, but different animals can grow in the same way. So we were very fortunate that in this case, all of the candidates that it could have been grew in very different ways. And this is because of their biology and the types of lifestyles that they led. So if you take a look at the sauropod, that's the middle section there, the black and white one. Essentially what you see is a very highly porous bone. So it's very light, it's like a sponge. And all of the blood vessels are arranged into these concentric rows. And that is essentially a sign of very, very rapid growth. And that makes sense because sauropods were the largest animals to live on land. And in order to achieve that, they had to grow at very fast rates. And all sauropods do this. And there are some really interesting studies on dwarf sauropods from other parts of Europe. And it shows that they became dwarves not by slowing their growth rate to what we would be seeing in our dinosaur on Egg in something that size, but instead they do it by shortening their lifespans. So they grow at really fast rates, but for much shorter periods of time. And so it's a really good indication if you find this type of bone texture with the concentric rings and the high porosity, that you're looking at a sauropod. Now, if you compare and contrast that to the one on the left, that's the egg bone there, what you can see is it's quite different. So the open spaces, the blood vessels, they're arranged randomly. They're not in concentric rows. The general porosity is much lower in this bone. And many of the signs that we get don't have they don't align with a fast growth strategy. The other thing to note as well is that sauropods rarely have what's called secondary remodeling, at least not at the age, not at a comparable age with this animal. And so the extra secondary remodeling that we have in the form of those secondary osteons, those donut-shaped things, that's a distinctive feature of the egg bone. So that also helped with the comparisons. Now, if we look at a theropod dinosaur, one of the meat-eating dinosaurs, again, this is the one that's on my shirt. This is its upper leg bone. We see that they also grow in kind of a similar way to other dinosaurs at relatively fast rates. But one major feature is if you look towards the bottom of that thin section on the right, you can see that there's kind of a nice smooth surface on the bottom of that bone. Now that's the inside of the bone. So much like modern birds today, ancient theropods also had hollow bones. And you can see this in thin section. Now, the very first slide that I showed of the egg bone, we could tell that that wasn't the case. There was a spongy center to the bone, kind of like an arrow bar. And theropods are more like a straw where they have a very open center. And so we could eliminate a theropod as a possibility. Besides which, there are some other features that don't line up very well either. For example, the higher rate of remodeling in the egg bone is different than most theropods, which tended to have less secondary remodeling. And so they had fewer donut shapes. And the rate of growth as well. In the bone on the right, it's growing at a relatively rapid rate, which you see in some theropods, and you do see others that grow at slower rates, but none as slow as the egg bone. So we could be fairly confident that we could eliminate the other kinds of dinosaurs that were living on the Isle of Skye, as far as we know at present. But we could also go one further, and we could compare the egg bone to what we suspected it was, a stegosaur, because actually Susie has done some fantastic work on the histology of stegosaur fibulae for another project. And so we had a really valuable comparison where we had kind of a proof positive of what we were looking at. So Elsa, if you could go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. And what we can see here is that the growth signals are essentially the same. And what we have are these kind of low density blood vessels. They're not arranged into rows, they're arranged randomly. That's true of the known stegosaur that Susie was able to thin section. We get signs of slow growth, and in even a broader range of stegosaurs, this is true, that they grew much more slowly than other dinosaurs their size. We're not sure exactly why biologically, or at least I'm not. But it is distinctive and it's unexpected in an animal of this size to have such slow growth. The other thing that coincides is that there's lots of secondary remodeling. And there was more in the bone that Susie sectioned on the right here. That one had more secondary remodeling extending even further towards the outside of the bone. And it also had more growth marks. So that's an adult dinosaur. If you look, you might be able to notice some small white arrows just towards the outside of that thin section. Unfortunately, I don't have a closer image of that to magnify it. But essentially that shows that it's an adult, like I mentioned, where all of the growth marks are stacked up on the outside. So it grew very little in the last 4 years of its life there. And so essentially with that combination, we had a really excellent way to show that not only is the growth style that we're seeing in this bone quite different than we would expect for the other candidate dinosaurs that it could have been, but also that its distinctive growth style, the features we were seeing that were unusual in this bone, are always present in other stegosaurs. And so it was a really kind of strong case to argue that not only did we not have one of these other dinosaurs, but we actually did have a stegosaur. So to me, it kind of ended up being a best case scenario where I wouldn't do this for every bone because it does take away some material as you're thin sectioning it. But in this case, it provided some really valuable information and another independent source of evidence to help with our identification as a stegosaur. So I'll hand it back now to Elsa to wrap things up.
Thanks very much, Greg. That was really cool. It's funny, you know, we worked together on this paper, but this is actually the first time that Greg and I have spoken to each other in person, as it were, online. And it's really interesting hearing him explain this. So, yeah, we've come to the end of our talk. And it seems that we have indeed found the first dinosaur outside of Skye, and know almost certainly that it was a stegosaur-like dinosaur. So before I finish, I just wanted to say that if you'd like to find out more about the paper itself, I've actually, just before this talk started, I put on my blogspot a non-technical summary of the paper. So basically I've gone through the paper and I've written it without all the technical jargon so that you can read through and find out for yourself exactly what it was we discovered and how we discovered it, and how we put the pieces together of the puzzle. And the paper itself was published in the Royal Society's journal, Earth and Environmental Science Transactions. So do check out giantsciencelady.blogspot.com and hashtag Stegosaurus, which I was desperately trying to get everybody on the TV and radio to use, but they never did. So it just leaves me to say thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you to the other speakers for speaking. And thank you to our sponsors, of course, and to the wonderful people of the Isle of Eigg and all of our institutions and friends and collaborators. If you have any questions, we would really, really love to hear from you now and talk more about Scottish fossils.